To mix history in San Volte, you need a good shaker, yes, just like when preparing some of the most famous cocktails. For example, I go crazy for the Vesper Martini, exactly, the cocktail invented by Ian Fleming for his famous James Bond. But today, we won't put spirits in our shaker. We'll put elements, historical elements, characters, places, events. We'll shake them all together and come up with a story so incredible that, I assure you, you'll hardly believe it. In our shaker, we put a European capital, London, a cosmopolitan city that, however, in the 1970s is also a city with a very deep background, with some underworld, not always respectable. Then a Caribbean island, a hideout, a private island, a good retreat, a place for fun and leisure. Then we add a robbery, a bank robbery, a robbery at one of the most renowned banks in London. And then we add some actors, photographers, ambiguous characters. And finally, our cherry on top, a noblewoman, actually a princess, at the center of 1,000 intrigues, 1,000 stories, a life so absurd it seems invented. And yet it's all true, it's all history, it's all real. It's a reality that sometimes gets mixed up with the gloss of tabloid newspapers, which the British are literally crazy about. It's a story that mixes with elements of crime reporting, but it's a story that needs to be told. And it's the story of Princess Margaret, the sister of Queen Elizabeth II, a tragic princess who searched everywhere for affection, recognition, and sometimes simply a moment of intimacy, but who took the wrong path, made the wrong friends, and got involved in games much, much bigger than herself. This is a story of intrigue, court life, and secrets. Princess Margaret, it was said, a very beautiful woman, a sophisticated woman, born on August 21, 1930 in Glamis Castle, Scotland, the second daughter of the man who at the time was the Duke of York, the future king, George VI. At the time of her birth, nothing suggested that she would become one of the most problematic figures of the 20th century British monarchy. First of all, she was not destined for the throne, because in the line of succession her sister Elizabeth came before her, and in fact, Elizabeth ascended to the throne after their father's death. Unlike her older sister Elizabeth, who was taught self-control and a sense of duty from childhood, Margaret grew up with greater emotional freedom. She was brilliant, witty, and musical.
Dotata, consapevole del proprio fascino.
Court observers soon noticed a substantial difference between the two sisters. Elizabeth was continuity. Margaret was the unpredictable one. The abdication of Edward VIII at the end of 1936 changed everything. This is a story that, among other things, we've already told you in the video dedicated to Wallis Simpson, which you can find on the channel. As we said, the Duke of York becomes king, King George VI, and Margaret rises in social status. During World War II, she is the sister. Even though they grew up inside a closed court, we could even say almost claustrophobic, due to the extremely strict security protocols and bombings. Both of them experienced some thrills in ordinary life, also trying to provide assistance as auxiliaries after the bombings in London. The private chronicles of that time speak of a young princess who was constantly seeking strong emotional stimulation, especially in her friendships with men. In 1944, at just 14 years old, Margaret met Peter Townsend, an officer in the Royal Air Force. He was a war hero, elegant, cultured, in his 30s, 16 years older than her. Townsend works as an equerry, so he has a constant daily presence at Buckingham Palace. Their relationship, which is initially formal, gradually transforms into a deep emotional bond. We need to be clear, there's no evidence of a physical relationship during those years. But the testimonies of those who spent time at Buckingham Palace agree on one fact: a growing intimate emotional bond, glances, unspoken understanding, confidences. Margaret saw in Townsend a protective figure, and also a bit of a romantic one. He saw in her a brilliant young woman trapped in a difficult role. The situation changed in 1952. George VI, suffering from lung cancer partly due to his smoking habit, died. In his place, a young queen, Elizabeth, Margaret's older sister, ascends the throne. At that time, she is 22 years old. Townsend, meanwhile, had gotten divorced, and it is precisely that detail that makes the relationship politically and religiously unacceptable. The Anglican Church, of which the monarch is the head, has never allowed marriage between a single person and a divorced person whose former spouse is still alive. It had already happened with Wallis Simpson and Edward VIII, so even in this case, it was impossible to allow Margaret to marry Townsend. It would have meant questioning the moral authority of the monarchy, which was already quite fragile after precisely the precedent set by Edward VIII. For years, the issue was treated as a private, confidential matter, even though it was a sort of constitutional time bomb. The government, the court, and the Queen herself put pressure on Margaret to give up. In 1955, after months of silence and speculation, Margaret publicly announces that she does not want to marry Peter Townsend. The statement is cold, formal, and devoid of emotion. Those closest to the princess speak of a devastated, humiliated woman, aware that she sacrificed her own happiness for an institution that would never truly reward her. And so, a second Margaret is born. After officially giving up Peter Townsend, Margaret is never the same again. The sacrifice. Even though the court considered the matter closed and the public saw it as something forgettable, that sacrifice had left its mark on her, an intimate, internal, irreversible fracture between her public role and her private life. In the years immediately following, we're talking about the early 1960s. Margaret became a constant presence in London's social scene. She frequents clubs, theaters, parties, meets aristocrats, artists, actors, photographers, musicians. The princess doesn't just attend, but she joins in, drinks, smokes, and flirts. She openly flirts with the men she likes. The press of the time, which was still bound by a certain institutional respect and hadn't become so sensationalist, only tells part of the story. According to reports written by the special branch, Margaret shows impulsive behavior, is emotionally unstable, and uninhibited for her rank. Between the late 1950s and the early 1960s, private accounts record a series of brief relationships, very intense but short-lived, with married men or men who were socially unsuitable. Nothing illegal, of course, but all deeply inappropriate. A recurring pattern can be seen in Margaret's choices. Charismatic men, but emotionally unavailable because they were already committed. All the relationships are marked by jealousy and power imbalances, because Margaret uses her rank to her advantage. She alternates between seduction and demands for attention, like a child. And when her lover finally pulls away, Margaret reacts badly, making scenes in public. There is emotional deprivation. There are issues that need to be resolved. Over the years, Margaret is seen drinking more and more. She drinks heavily during official dinners, and even more during private occasions, at parties. She certainly wasn't the only one doing it in British high society, but she was the only one doing it in front of everyone. And this caused a scandal at court. A royal official. In a confidential note from 1958, he writes, "Her Royal Highness, Princess Margaret, does not seem interested in protecting the dignity of the institution. She feels almost like an outsider." A very harsh but revealing judgment. Margaret felt oppressed by the monarchy, and it was in 1958 that her life changed. She meets Anthony Armstrong Jones, a nonconformist photographer, cultured, witty, coming from a bohemian background, very far from the rigidity and formality of Buckingham Palace. The opposite of the men the court would have approved for courting and engagement, especially Armstrong Jones. He wasn't intimidated by the princess's title, but treated her like a regular girl. For Margaret, it's a revelation. The relationship begins in secret, with an intensity that is initially innocent. Then it becomes a fiery, passionate relationship, even physically, with a sometimes ambiguous power dynamic. In 1959, the scandal explodes. In the court circles, people find out. Yet the reaction of the court is positive. Anthony was single. Unlike the others, he wasn't married, British, acceptable from a religious point of view. He could have been a solution. For this reason, the court gives Anthony a title, that of Lord Snowdon, in order to make him a nobleman. And as proof of the official engagement, which was in 1960, Margaret seems to have finally found a balance between love and duty. But it almost seems like an escape route, not a well-thought-out choice. The press starts digging deeper. It turns out that Anthony Armstrong Jones is not exactly a faithful man. In fact, he has several secret affairs. And Margaret herself continues to have relationships, sometimes just by letter, sometimes much more, with various married men. There's an instability, something that isn't right. The wedding is celebrated on May 6, 1960. It's a historic event, the first royal wedding broadcast on television. Everyone is watching it. The public image was that of a modern, elegant couple, symbolizing a monarchy finally keeping up with the times. Almost a preview of the wedding between Charles and Diana Spencer, but in private, things are different. However, it deteriorates very quickly. There are parallel behaviors. Armstrong Jones continues to see models, actresses, acquaintances from the art world and sleeps with them. Margaret alternates between phases of deep emotional dependence and periods of open rebellion when she leaves home. The arguments become violent, verbal, sometimes even public. Both of them drink a lot. And another forbidden word starts to creep in: drugs. According to biographers, the marriage isn't working, or rather it's held together by a dysfunctional mechanism. Snowden, now Lord Snowden, is no longer Anthony Armstrong Jones. He humiliates Margaret with blatant infidelities. Margaret responds with increasingly provocative actions, and they both hurt each other, using the press as an indirect weapon. They let the newspapers publish the scandals to hurt each other. It's a kind of emotional sadomasochism. Margaret, however, continues to be judged, a rebellious princess, unmanageable. At the end of the 1960s, while her marriage with Snowden is already compromised, Margaret starts another relationship, a relationship that marks a point of no return, with John Bindon. Everything a royal's lover should never be. A character actor known for playing gangsters and criminals, with a criminal record for assault, described by those who know him well as a violent, manipulative, and sexually dominant man. The relationship isn't official, of course, but it is widely documented by several testimonies. Bindon has a brutal, unromantic pull on Margaret. Several friends of the princess describe the relationship as physically intense but psychologically destructive. Bindon, years later, would talk about extreme sexual encounters, episodes of consensual violence, and a power dynamic that swung between attraction and fear. There's no written evidence confirming these stories. But the fact that Buckingham Palace never took any legal action against Bindon to refute him or silence him fueled the suspicion that the actor's statements were, at least in part, true. And it is during this period that Margaret's behavior visibly worsens. In public, she appears unkempt. Sometimes drinking makes her ramble, and she uses vulgar language. Or she suddenly skips official events without warning, or she gets herself admitted to a clinic under a false name. Up to this point, we have the portrait of a princess out of control, troubled, emotionally fragile. At the beginning of the 1970s, now comes our last ingredient in the mix. And it's a criminal element. September the 1971, a group of criminals, still not fully identified to this day, digs a tunnel, starting from a shop they rented. Leaves Sack, a ladies' handbag shop under Baker Street, and robs the vault of Lloyd's Bank. The Baker Street robbery, which a few years ago was the subject of a fairly famous movie, becomes known not only for the boldness of the heist, but for what is never officially told. First of all, the real amount of the loot. Some say 300,000 pounds, some say £1 million, some say £3 million at the time. Anyway, an enormous sum. Then, because some of the owners of the safety deposit boxes that were robbed in the vault never reported the contents of those safety deposit boxes. And finally, because of the journalistic investigations conducted by the Daily Mail and the Guardian, according to which among the recovered material there were compromising photographs of government ministers involved in acts of sadomasochism or pedophilia, or even of a certain princess, and intimate behavior with an actor known for playing gangster roles in movies, John Bindon. The theories are piling up. It is said that, in fact, there are these photos left on display by the Baker Street gang inside the vault, almost as if to say, we know your secrets. Maybe we have more. Don't chase us. Don't try to catch us. In reality, at least half of the gang will be caught and put on trial. Part of the stolen goods is never found. There is also an unverified report that the government issued a D notice to censor the press. It's a rumor that circulates within the justice system, even though it's never been proven. In fact, some government officials have openly denied it. Yet that interpretation, according to which there were compromising photos of Princess Margaret together with John Bindon inside one of the Baker Street vaults, continues to circulate. The silence that has fallen over the affair still fans the flames of this whole story to this day. In 1978, Margaret and Lord Snowdon divorced. It was the first royal divorce since the time of Henry VIII. It marked the end of attempts at normalization. The princess has a royal failure. After the divorce, Princess Margaret no longer seeks any form of public respectability. She prefers distance. She prefers to go to a private Caribbean island, Mustique, far from the British press and the rigidity of the court that she can no longer stand. There, Margaret can be what she was never allowed to be in London, a woman unbound by protocol who doesn't have to account for her every action. In Mustique, Margaret spends time with artists, musicians, eccentric aristocrats, and much younger men. The relationships she has are without any expectation of stability, intense, brief, physical, and ending as soon as even a hint of emotional dependence appears, whether from the princess or her lover. Generally, Margaret chooses men who are 20 years younger. Now that she's approaching 50, she prefers men in their 20s or 30s, no older. But she no longer seeks protection. She seeks a form of stability, of control. According to several accounts, on Mustique, the princess drinks daily, smokes constantly, sleeps little, alternates between moments of euphoria and others of depression, and displays unrestrained language. The freedom she had found in the Caribbean came at a price: emotional isolation. And so now we move toward the final part of this story. A story that, in the 1990s, made the princess pay the price for all her excesses: a stroke, respiratory problems, serious complications related to smoking and alcohol, very rare public appearances, often embarrassing for the court. Margaret is never rehabilitated in the media. She is not given the role of a wise elder like her mother or a loving figure. She becomes almost an uncomfortable remnant of an era the monarchy wanted to forget, the era of scandals. Even though scandals in the 1990s start to resurface daily within the court, her relationship with her sister Elizabeth remains formal and proper. There is no evidence of a complete reconciliation, even though Elizabeth has always retained some affection toward her younger sister. Margaret dies at 71 in 2002. A few weeks later, her mother also passes away. With Margaret, an era comes to a definitive end, but not our story. Because today historians agree on one essential point. Margaret was not simply a capricious princess. She was a woman raised to desire but not to choose, a figure used as a warning. Don't be like her. An emotional lightning rod for a monarchy that seemed to be in crisis, and a person systematically deprived of the possibility to make mistakes in her personal affairs. The Baker Street case, the relationship with John Bindon, the official silences, sometimes censorship in the press. Everything indicates that her attempts at scandal were not about love. It was just the possibility that a princess might show desires incompatible with the image of the crown. Margaret paid for all this with her reputation, her health, her loneliness, and a historical memory that is often distorted. Princess Margaret was not a heroine. She wasn't even a martyr. She was something more unsettling, a royal woman in a system that didn't allow for real women, and that's why she still unsettles people today. There's one last element in our story which also goes back to that robbery on Baker Street. The file on that robbery at the Special Branch in Scotland Yard is classified by order of the Crown until 2056. An order was given to keep silent about the matter for such a long period that one has to wonder why the press must not disclose it, why the public must not know, why secrecy must continue to be maintained about an event that happened over half a century ago. Maybe because the rumors, the assumptions, the hypotheses, everything that was said at the time, maybe there's a grain of truth in there. Maybe. But to know more, we would have to wait until that period expires. We would have to wait for the archives to finally open and shed full light on the Baker Street case, perhaps the last secret of Princess Margaret, the last case of a royal scandal, still partially in the shadows even today.